Hey, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happenstance into this Truth Bomb Riff. My name is Patrick Lovell. I am the producer with a $71 trillion truth, and I am recording this on Wednesday, September 17th, 2025, at approximately 2 p.m. my time. And I just decided to hit record because my mind is flooded with really pretty much what we're all flooded with, but with the caveat that I have information that unfortunately not all of you are flooded with. And that's the intent of this dialogue, to take what is in front of our face, to open up the door and pull back the curtain on what is behind door number three, that is basically creating all that we're in the midst of and has been for a very long time. And it's crazy. Everything that we're in the midst of is nuts. And I can't believe literally that I think it's the 17th anniversary of the 2008 great financial crisis occurred 2 days ago, because that was the day that changed my life. And I'll never forget it. I remember I was on this trail. It was a beautiful day, not unlike today. I'm looking out my window in the front yard here, and it is beautiful today. And the trees were changing color, and I was in the mountains with my dog. Oh my God, I loved my dog at that time. Brandy, I miss you so much. And I had my son with me. My son was very young. I mean, he's 20 now, so that's 17 years ago. I guess he was 3 years old, right? Oh my God. And I was on a trail and I was waiting for a phone call from somebody I had been trying to put a deal together with for some time, who was from, well, he was very successful in his own right. And we had been talking about a year and putting together a major deal together that would have put me in the perfect place. And I expected to make that happen. And I was about to celebrate my 40th birthday. And I thought I was going to hear good things, because actually the night before, he had notified me that he had shown the contract to the attorneys and he was willing to move forward and everything was great and ready to go. And all of a sudden, I get this phone call. I get this phone call. It was the middle of the day. And he called me and he said, "I'm so sorry. Are you seeing what's happening in markets right now?" And I said, "No." And he said that they're tanking. I'm hemorrhaging more money than I've ever hemorrhaged in my life. And I'm sorry, I don't have time to deal with this right now. I got to stop the bleeding and I will circle back at some point. Basically, my heart sank. I was looking at my son. I was looking at my dog. I was thinking of my wife. I was thinking about, oh my God, what am I going to do? And from that point forward, I was jettisoned on a never ending, unbelievable odyssey that's led to this day, 17 years later. And right before I hit play, the big news on the front page of the New York Times was, oh, interesting. I'm seeing a group of jet fighters fly low. Fortunately, they're not flying in this direction. That might have been weird. Squirrel. But the front page of the New York Times revealed that the Fed is like everything else, from top building law firms and universities on down the path, and studios and networks and pretty much everyone else over the course of the last 7 months is capitulating to Trump. They lowered interest rates. And as of a moment, unlike what happened 17 years ago, I bet you markets are going up. They're going up, not like a parabolic needle going vertical, but they're definitely up. So, congrats to all of you people who have been waiting for interest rate cuts. But I think that's pretty monumental, considering what I need to reveal to you that the whole system won't. That really ties together the last 17 years. And but there's more things that have happened in the last, let's say, 72 hours that feels like 17 years. And I want to do like I always do, start with what we're all talking about and then back into what is, so that you can understand what they're not telling you. And who's they? The power. Okay, well, who's the power? Is the Trump administration? Are we talking about them specifically? Well, in some ways. Okay, are we talking about the Democrats and the DNC? Yeah, in some ways. Are we talking about the media? Yeah, and in many ways. Are we talking about the Supreme Court? Oh, yeah. Are we talking about more things than that? Oh, yeah. But let's just start with what everybody is talking about. So I do think it's relevant from a number of angles. But first, it was in my backyard, not too far from where I live, and felt way too familiar because I have a 20-year-old son who very much reminded me in terms of the story, not that he's ever threatened to kill the president or Charlie Kirk or anybody to that effect, but because the composite story of Charlie Cook reflects what I have been very aware of on a personal level for some time. Um, the story that I'm relating is that the assumed assassin, although I think that it's pretty safe to say he was self incriminating based on certain things that have come to the fore based on evidence, but then there's also some tricky things that seem awfully peculiar as well that I'll address. But the young man who assassinated Charlie Kirk is a name by the name a young man by the name of Tyler Robinson. And Tyler Robinson is a white guy that stands about 6'2". And from the videos that I saw him running on the roof at Utah State University, just something about his mannerisms, quite frankly, reminded me of my son. And as that story started to manifest, I remember there was about a 48-hour period after Charlie Kirk was killed. And of course, we all saw the assassination and it ran out. And then, of course, the reactions that led to monumental things that are all packed into this situation that went a bunch of different ways and splintered. And I happened to have a dialogue the other day with a guy who's an up and coming journalist, at least to people and broadening his audience. He's been a journalist for 30 years, but this guy knows things. And he had mentioned things to me such as, well, was it potentially connected to Israel? Because Charlie Kirk apparently had recently turned negative on Israel, not so much Israel as a country or Jews in general, even though he is ultra Christian, but apparently because he was aghast at the Gaza incursion and the nonstop proliferation of arms to Israel that appears to have way more influence than I guess Charlie Kirk was willing to agree with, although I had heard from the same source and many other sources that turning point in Charlie Kirk's very existence was due to funding from vectors of high net worth individuals that were connected to Israel and maybe Israel directly. I don't want to really go into too much detail about that because I'm using this as a periphery to get to the information that they don't want you to know. Who's they? The entire system of power. Okay, back to what your mind is on. Sorry, squirrel, ping pong. Yeah, we all have it. Too much information, too much noise. Get to the point. I will. I'm going to give you the information that they don't want you to know. But you need to get there through the things that you recognize and understand so you can actually have an opinion and think through what it is that I'm saying and maybe have a connection to me because what I'm saying might be resonating with you. Because in this age of algorithms and this age of everybody's got a voice and everybody can platform and everybody can go there, everybody has something to say. And it's like high school. It's a popularity contest. Do you like the way I look? Do you like the way I sound? Do I sound like I know what I'm talking about? Do you have any familiarity with me? Are you just discovering me for the first time? These are all things that kind of sort through whatever becomes the algorithm, and then would determine the audience, and ultimately whether or not people begin to listen to you in the midst of this ocean of madness and noise and lies. And the reason, again, that you may want to pay attention to me is if all of that checks off your boxes, is because I'm revealing to you what they don't want you to know. I can get you like 100, degrees behind the system of machinations of power because I've been there, done that, and I know what I'm talking about in a monumental way that nobody else on planet Earth does. Does that sound crazy? It is, but I take that back because the people who are getting away with it, the ones that don't want you to know what it is that I'm revealing to you, yeah, they're the ones that are in control of everything I'm about to unpack and get you into the real story that they don't want you to know. So again, Tyler Robinson reminded me of my son because the story as it played out, this guy was someone who was, in the pandemic era, meaning COVID, and a lot of disaffected young men wound up in chat rooms. They didn't go to school. They did their learning online, and then they got involved with video games, and then it would go into a much deeper, darker scenario of which I believe Tyler Robinson actually had some experience, so to speak. And the 4chan is a really questionable place, ironically, because the only thing I know about 4chan is what was revealed to me through the revelations of all things Q back in about 2020 during the first insurrection, and Q being sort of a makeshift curiosity for people on the right that might refer to information that was coming through that Hive network, that would lead to people being, quite frankly, what's the word I want to look for? Not so much galvanized, but activated into action. Many of the January Sixers, they were a part of 4chan and Q wasn't just a random occurrence. Q was the amalgamation of what appears to be many major players that went rogue and went free agency out of the National Security Administration, the NSA, and other levels of intelligence who know how these things work at the highest levels, that they then go into the back channels of where young disaffected youth are, and they prey upon them. Predation. The young men might be in these situations for kinky sex, proclivities that, they're, obviously maybe obsessed with or, curious about, or whatever happens when you're at the age of 16 to 22, when your hormones are raging, right? And you kind of go into places that you probably shouldn't, but there are people that can become gatekeepers to that information, and they can also prey upon people that they know are into video games and into violence and into sex and into maybe strange, twisted, distorted sex, all of which they can use in their algorithms to create propaganda and outcomes. And I can assure you that's what intelligence does, and that's what the big boys do, especially when they have an incredible amount of expertise, professionals, and budget for outcomes. One of which, in this particular situation, because of Q, turned out to be January 6th. But of course, I digress. But I do want to use this caveat in that recently I've posted on Blue Sky two videos that had been produced over the weekend by Anonymous. And they were pretty decent. But Anonymous was something that I knew a lot about back in the Occupy Wall Street time period when they came to the fore. Anonymous was all over the place in those days. And they've always presented themselves as against the elite, that they're the truth tellers, that they can bring out through this Guy Fawkes mask, the sort of periphery of what the power is that's behind all of the different tables, or I should say doors, that's funny, I said tables, doors that hide what the true power is and how they operate, just like I told you about NSA and Q, right? And of course, they always hid behind masks, which I thought was interesting. I'm not hiding behind a mask. And by the way, I'm not an algorithm, just so you know, for those of you getting to see me for the first time, just in case those of you who are compelled by this start to like, subscribe, and share in a monumental way, because the information that I have that they don't want you to know is the information that can turn the tables on this calamity of everything that we can all see in front of our face. But I'm going to continue to discern so that you understand what it is and how we are all in the matrix of getting played at the moment. So again, back to Tyler Robinson. So Tyler Robinson is this disaffected young man who grew up in a conservative household. Apparently he's Mormon. I think that his father may have been a sheriff or affiliated in some way with law enforcement. And like a lot of young men his age in a state like Utah, a red state primarily, they are all pretty much born with guns. The Wild West, man, very libertarian. Everybody learns how to hunt and handle guns early. And by the way, I'm from Texas originally, and I have never been anti-gun, but I definitely am anti-gun in the wrong hands because of a lot of stuff that I'm talking about and regulation. And profit motive and many other things that lead to school shootings. And again, one of which that happened on the same day that Tyler had assassinated Charlie Kirk, which of course took over the world, while the same right-wing Christian young guy shot several kids in Colorado that happened to be coincidentally the same district that Columbine was in, which of course started, I would think, our full awareness of these young, crazy situations that would lead to carnage for the last 25 years. And again, I could go off on that tangent, but I'll just park that there. But the interesting thing about the aftermath of Tyler Robinson and Charlie Kirk and all of these sort of methodologies, specifically as it relates to the reactionary sort of circus that becomes fodder for control. Now, historically, there was a moment during the rise of the Third Reich that took place, I believe, in 1933, where a Nazi lieutenant, not exactly sure what his rank was, but his name was Ernst Rove. And Ernst Rove was assassinated because the Germans were fighting with communists, or I should say the Nazis were fighting with communists in the street. They were all Germans. And then there was the other sort of initiative of attacking Jewish people, and I believe deporting them to Poland on the trains as early as 1933. Now, I know that Auschwitz and the final solution and all of those elements didn't come until much later. But the assassination of Ernst Rove created a pivotal moment, an inflection point, to where all of the things that were brewing, because the Nazi Party had been growing over the course of many years, and that's a story, a major story in itself. But at this moment, as a result of that assassination, it would lead to such atrocities as Kristallnacht, which is incredible. What would happen after that? Well, of course, World War II, but inside the belly of the beast and everything and everywhere that the Nazis operated would lead to the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is what directly led to Israel. And I was talking to an incredible journalist who actually lived in Israel for a long time, and like me is Jewish, and I'm a Reformed Jew, and I'm supportive of Israel. But at the same time, I've had a lot of questions about Israel since October 7th because of Netanyahu, and I've been very transparent about that on these truth bombs that are all affiliated with this as well. But the entry point as it relates to this moment is many people on the right, the far right, and the far left, where this whole thing is now converging, are like, wait a second, Charlie Kirk may have been assassinated by Israel to shut him up based on the Epstein files. Of course, that's one of many different speculations that were out there, but it certainly, rang like it was a possibility in this Orwellian science fiction dystopian nightmare that we're all in the midst of. But again, when I saw Tyler run on the roof and I saw him run away, I thought to myself, because one of the peripheries to the story about it being, maybe a hit job by Mossad and all of those things to cover up, everything with Trump and the Epstein files, would have been a corollary story that I believe it was The Guardian that had released something that also made sense as well, that there was a private jet apparently that somebody had eyes on that wasn't accounted for that landed, but there was no, I'm trying to think of, because when you land at an airport, when you take off, I mean, everything is by the book and they keep track of everything, the flight logs. And so apparently there was a private jet, I'm assuming like a Gulfstream jet or something along those lines, that was unaccounted for, that had landed, that apparently disappeared. I don't know if that was speculation or real. I didn't have time to go into it. I don't get paid to do this stuff. I'm just reacting to the information that I have as it relates to this story as a door opener to one of the many doors that I open for you to get you to the point of the information that, of course, this power doesn't want you to understand. So again, I thought it was plausible, maybe in some weird, what do we call it, the Manchurian Candidate sort of way back in the 70s when the CIA did stuff like this, and reminded of another Utahn, Robert Redford, in The Day of the Jackal, which I think was connected to that. The CIA could, basically create people to do assassinations and not know they're doing that, and that by the way, was connected to Project Ultra. All of this stuff is real. And so when you have a background in understanding all of that type of intelligence, black ops, and immediately because of all of these things that are going on, you're like, I wonder if that's a possibility. But my instinct again was that guy looks like he's a regular Utah kid that may have gone down the path of 4chan, having grown up in a very conservative family that obviously would make sex so, what's the word I'm looking for? Because I've always thought this about these types of people. So, what, God, it just, the sin of it all, it's right at the tip of my tongue, and I know some of you are responding to it at the moment. But where you can't talk about sex, you can't think about anything outside of the normal four walls of what is accepted and approved by that particular upbringing, and it became somewhat, a different sort of consideration that maybe this guy was just a guy that grew up, because they showed him wearing Trump costume, I think, during Halloween in 2019. And then again, he was playing video games that are associated with neo-Nazis and all of these nuances online that made it seem like he could have been far, far right, but maybe he was far, far right. And then suddenly he discovered, because of all of this alienation and isolation and, all of these things that weren't maybe really lining up in his life in a meaningful way, he discovered something different. Maybe 4chan was his gateway to that. I think that's pretty plausible considering the millions of people that seemingly do that. Now, I know it's, for me, completely way beyond the scope of my imagination from a personal usage standpoint. That's just not a world I operate in. And that's why, quite frankly, for me, a lot of these things as it related to Epstein for years and years and years was like, ugh, how is it possible that they could use these honey traps of these young women that they were pulling out of like poverty to make them promises that they could give them security and, maybe college tuition, maybe give them opportunity they didn't have, but at a price. And that price to be able to, blackmail very rich, wealthy men around the world so that somebody like Epstein would have information on these guys to leverage at a time of his choosing, which of course, that sort of operation has existed for a lot longer than I probably know. And I'm aware of this type of stuff lasting for centuries, to be quite frank with you. And the most recent version, of course, from Prohibition forward, had a lot of the same sorts of traps. You get powerful people trapped in scenarios, you can leverage them. And that's exactly the world of where Roy Cohn came from, the famous attorney that taught Donald Trump never admit to anything and never apologize. And it showed Trump the lay of the land that created the Donald Trump that we've all come to know and love, right? The same Donald Trump that in the aftermath of, what the FBI has been revealing that seemed to play perfectly into the broader strokes of what the right wing has been itching for a long time in the lie, deny, switch the blame and implicate scenario, was that this guy was a domestic terrorist that was incubated in the world of trans. Is really the semantics, is really the kind of the initiative. It's what the FBI literally revealed text today that many, including the right, like Candace Owens and many other on the right, are saying is bullshit. And I saw some stuff earlier today that, people like blood coming out of her whatever. I can't think of her name because she hasn't been on my radar for some time. The former Fox salacious on-air personality and whatever role she plays, within the whole Fox paradigm, was saying these are ridiculous. And it's really interesting coming. And I think Tucker Carlson said the same thing, by the way, which I'll never listen to any of these guys unless they pop up on my feeds, with somebody that's bringing me the information. I listen to it and I'm like, my God, they're making points that, this initiative is insane. Again, going back to the Nazis using the so the assassination of a lieutenant to spark a massive populist outrage that led to Kristallnacht, that basically became the tidal wave of fascism, even though it was definitely well in play long before that. So that's just one issue that we're all contending with, right? So where does it go? Well, 2 nights ago, we had Stephen Miller, the Jewish anti-immigration fanatic that looks like a squid boy who likes to proffer his best impersonation of Goebbels as the chief of staff of the White House, that said transparently, provocatively, that we're going to stop these domestic terrorists by any means, all and every means, using the police. We're going to go after organized left-wing radicals. We're going to confiscate their money. We're going to get them fired. We're going to use every trick and piece of power and leverage at our disposal to destroy their lives. And if we can't get them arrested, then we're going to deport slash what happens when you go to your own island, exiled. Those were his very words. And he said that again on a network I don't watch. He said it on Sean Hannity. And I saw it and I'm like, oh my God. And basically, I felt like I was just, I had this hollow pit in my stomach. I felt queasy. Because for those of you who know me, you know that I've been saying forever that corruption births and fuels fascism. I've been warning about this nonstop. If you're just discovering, I mentioned that I'm a producer. I produced a prolific work that everybody has to wrap their heads around called The Con, that you can find at www.thecon.tv. It's free because all the American people buy are lies. And that led to this monumental odyssey where afterwards, because we got quashed from bringing this to the public, where the tens of millions of people who got destroyed by the subject matter of what my documentary series reveals never understood in a meaningful way, at least not in the mass of which they were destroyed, and which was the domino that created this entire world that we're in the midst of, that I prefaced going back to September 15th, 2008, 17 years ago. It's all part of the same continuum, and I promise you it even started earlier than that. But going back to the last 24 hours. So you've got the assassination of Charlie Kirk. You've got what appears to be this growing and metastasizing storyline that could lead to the rationale and the galvanization of extremist groups to basically attack, I guess in this case, potentially trans people. And why would they want, in addition to, and they being the Trump administration and, what appears to be a right-wing paramilitary operation in ICE that now has more budget than the Marines, that were put into cities all over the United States against what appellate courts had decided was constitutional and unconstitutional, not to mention a Governor Gavin Newsom suing because everything was so topsy-turvy. There was just the opposite, going back to January 6th, of what Donald Trump did during a real insurrection, which, of course, the National Guard and the troops stood down. There's more firepower in the Beltway that could have easily handled the insurrection if it wasn't an inside job. And oh yeah, by the way, the January 6th insurrection, congressional inquiry, the entire time they were trying to put this whole thing on Donald Trump. And for everybody watching Donald Trump right now, in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk, it was so crystal clear that Trump could care less about Charlie Kirk. He said something about my friends, and this is going to give us the opportunity to destroy the left. But he was like doing it from like figuring out interior decoration for the new ballroom at the White House that he wants to create, probably after looking at pictures at his, 747 that got from UAA, while all of the other people within the system are actually doing the work of the billionaire technocrats, which are behind the door, that have created all this thing that's basically decades in the making, that would lead to what appears to be the clampdown, which is incidentally for all of you Clash fans out there, that's one of the most impactful songs that basically, engineered who I became, or I should say, influenced who I became. Joe Strummer in the Clash and the Clampdown, because I'm anti-fascist, I'm anti-Nazi. I have been my whole life, and that's been my North Star. But I figured out because of this insane odyssey that I've been on that the flip side of fascism is corruption. You can't have fascism without corruption. And oh, yeah, in light of all of these elements that are circling around the Charlie Kirk assassination and all of the elements that are coming out of Tyler Robinson's texts and what the FBI may or may not have done to configure what appears to be a propaganda sort of initiative. This on top, of course, how many of us saw yesterday in the Senate, Cory Booker going after Kash Patel as well as Adam Schiff. And what was it about? The Epstein files. Release the Epstein files. But Kash Patel is like, look, the Epstein files begins and ends with Jeffrey Epstein. And everybody knows that's absolutely insane. But let's talk about Tyler Robinson and trans as a far left conspiracy to promote and to create domestic violence. In light of course, what the shooting in Colorado would symbolize, which every other shooting, I think, over the course of the last 20 years, I don't know what the exact percentages are, but they appear to be mostly white young males that are disaffected youth that got guns way too easily, high-powered assault rifles to murder children in schools. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that would be plausible to create Tyler Robinson, would it not? Regardless if he was in a relationship with somebody who was transitioning in whatever all of that was. But it does look like, Robinson did it. I think he admitted to it. I think they did have that. But it's so hard to really fully understand who's telling the truth under what circumstances. And I could go into the governor of Utah. I could go into everything with media and everything else. But then that would take 4 or 5 hours. And that's not the point, because what I want to do is get you from all of these things that I've been bringing up so far through the door, all the way to the end to see Oz and how this whole thing works. Now, meanwhile, I did see today, and I think this is worthy of bringing up before I transition to the task at hand. Netanyahu and Israel and the IDF are definitely all in Gaza. And I think it's the last phase of the campaign by way of the IDF. And let's not forget that a few days ago, in the midst of all of this, that the Israelis finally, interestingly enough to me, at least either assassinated or tried to assassinate senior Hamas leadership holed up in Qatar. And again, remind me, oh, wait a second. Is Qatar UAE? I'm trying to think of, it's the sliver on the east side of Saudi Arabia. No, United Arab Emirates is up above, and they're the ones who gave Donald Trump the 747. But Qatar dropped $2 billion on Trump being a saboteur to give top secret clearance in AI for a $2 billion fee to the Qataris, which apparently has all sorts of ramifications as it relates to, the Navy, for example. And I don't want to litigate that because I don't have enough information. But again, it's just part and parcel to the insanity that we're in the midst of and the carnage and the brutality of what's happened in Gaza. I want to address from this perspective. I mentioned that I'm Jewish. I come from a mixed family. My father came out of a Lutheran family. His mother became a born-again Christian after my father's dad died and after World War II. Long story. My dad, very, very smart guy, ended up putting himself through college. He got scholarships, ended up as a lawyer, and then got married to my mother. And my mother came from a Jewish family, and her family hails from Ukraine. And so half of my family are basically, right-wing Christian Texans in some capacity. At least that's my perception of them, and I grew up with them. And my father's mother's last name is Schmidt, and they were German of the sort of Aryan nation German, or I should just say Aryan German. They were Texas farmers. They weren't Nazis, but they were the ones that obviously, genetically were, more akin to what Hitler was all about, and the superiority of the Germanic, race, or I should just say the white race. But all things being equal, I grew up not experiencing a massive amount of anti-Semitism that I was aware of, really ever, but not that was in my face, particularly in my family, but I certainly was aware of it because the closest person in my life was my grandfather on my mother's side, who was a Zionist because of the Holocaust and because of 1,000 years of pogroms and because of, survival. It's like when we think of Israel and what we're seeing now with the brutality and the carnage of the genocide in Gaza, I come at it from a perspective of 1,000 years of understanding of anti-Semitism and pogroms and everything that the Jewish people had incurred, throughout the Roman Empire and their dissolution to, migrating into Eastern and Western Europe, and just the amazing, unbelievable history of it all. And yeah, again, I've always been of the mind that Israel has to exist from that perspective, which again is why I'm completely anti-fascist. And by the way, the only real, because I'm a Reformed Jewish guy, which means I'm not a very uber religious guy, but the one story in my biblical teachings that I've always hung a hat on was Exodus and Moses, which is liberty from pharaohs, which leads to the Ten Commandments, which is essentially the law. Now we could talk about, the first four commandments to God and all that kind of stuff. But the point being is I come from a centerpiece of liberty and justice for all predicated on the law. In fact, my colleague the other day just happened to remind me of my bar mitzvah speech on my 13th birthday, that my thesis was about honesty and truth and justice. This has been a part of who I am the whole time. And so throughout my knowledge and my detailed knowledge of really all of the conflicts between the Israelis and the entire Muslim world since its incarnation, I'm apt to be able to engage dialogue about every single piece of it, from the so-called, what many people call the Nakba, but other people would call, escaping the Holocaust and having a place to land. And then you get into the Balfour Declaration and you get into all of these other things. And then you start to kind of see all of these things recently with these sort of theories that, okay, Israel was actually an imperialist experiment. There was a trade-off, and then you have to understand World War I, but more importantly, you have to understand oil. And so coming up in this sort of background of who I am and understanding all of these different things, particularly as my North Star is anti-fascism and liberty and justice for all, and Israel was always presumably a democracy. And for most of my life, the idea was we're trying to sort out a two-state solution, but then that doesn't go well because there's extremists on both sides, but the extremists on the Israeli side really didn't come to be, in my mind, as extremist or as effective as they are until Sheldon Adelson became a giant financial supporter, and I'm sure many others that were in that network, in the West Bank and others. And of course, they gave back Gaza. Shimon Peres, no, it wasn't Shimon Peres, it was the other one, the general who's a heavier, who I think of as the tank commander. But of course, they walled off Gaza right after. And so, throughout the course of the last, 25 years or so, after it was the Intifada that led to all sorts, manner, shape, or form of homicide bombings in Israel, where, what we call homicide terrorists. No, is that the word I'm looking for? These guys would put on belts with shrapnel and nails and this, that, and the other. And when they turned themselves into human bombs, they'd go on buses. And the idea was to murder and maim as many people as they could. They went into restaurants, they did this, that, and the other, and they were offensive. That was the whole idea. Use terrorism to do what Hamas had always baked into its entire initiative, which was to destroy Israel from the very beginning. And so, was I aware of all of that? Yeah. Was I aware of what they did when they built the wall? Of course I was. And then the wall became the most guarded wall, I think, on planet Earth in terms of technology. And it's been a battle and very difficult. And I kept always hoping throughout the entirety of the evolution of this thing that we would see a Palestinian that would evolve above the carnage of terrorism and bring the notion of, let's say, a Reverend Martin Luther King, somebody that would put Israel in a position to where military action and response would have been looked at by the world in a different light, particularly if there was a meeting of the minds that we can coexist. And when October 7th happened, for example, the first thing I thought of as the carnage started to develop is I grew up in the Western United States. I grew up in Texas. I lived in Arizona for college. I lived in California for a long time. So I've been in and out of Mexico for most of my life. I understand the border. I understand immigration. I understand the influence of Mexicans in the United States, both of our economy and basically the historical narrative. But never did I ever see that in the worst contrition of organized crime in East LA, for example, would there be an all out military like assault to destroy all of East LA to get the gangbangers? Now we could talk about, well, yeah, maybe if you ever saw the movie with Denzel Washington, which is one of the most terrifying movies I've ever seen, called Training Day, which is about corruption, that you might be like, well, that's because they were laundering drugs together and arms and munitions, and the guys are getting paid, and the LAPD, and they were probably working with the CIA and all sorts of funky shit. Yeah, that's part of it too, by the way, which then we could say Epstein again. But going back to Israel and October 7th, when it first happened, I was outraged. I was absolutely horrified because I kept seeing over and over and over the videos of that woman, Nora, that was kidnapped and thrown on the back of the motorcycle. And you started hearing all of these stories about all of the people at the rave, the all-night peace rave, that were murdered. And those are types of people I would have hung out with. And I could see myself in an environment like that. And then all of a sudden, here comes all of these paragliders, shooting and dismembering and killing and raping and pillaging and all of these types of things. And my initial reaction, kind of like 9/11 initially, would have been, okay, it's on. And right away, Benjamin Netanyahu right away said, this is war. And in my mind, war is war. War isn't a campaign where you fight with one hand behind your back. You use every, opportunity at your disposal to defeat the enemy. Unlike what we did in Vietnam, and quite frankly, unlike what we did for the most part in the last 20 years of the war against terror. And there's a reason for that. But in the case of October 7th, my immediate reaction was what I just proclamated. But then as time wore on and we started to see attacks on hospitals and schools, and it was all out, I was like, what is going on? Now, meanwhile, I started asking questions because I always ask questions. I've got a lot of questions that are still unresolved about 9/11, but I've got a lot of answers about 9/11, which are relevant to this part of the conversation. So on October 7th, the one thing that I look at in a big way, immediately I did, and it kind of bore out, and now more information is coming down the pike. But I was like, okay, wait a second. You're going to tell me that paragliders got over the wall without any effort, without like 99% of them being shot down? I thought that was implausible. But then, of course, the story was, oh yeah, they shifted all the troops to the West Bank because of other things that were happening, and they got lazy and this, that, and the other. Yeah, okay, sure. But at the same time, we saw later, of course, when Iran launched 1,200 missiles, as they have many times over the course of the last 20 years, that Israel's Iron Dome shot out of the sky. So you're going to shoot down in like an 8-hour period 1,200 missiles, but you can take out the paragliders. Okay, yeah, sure, no problem. But see, I came from that construct, quite frankly, after 9/11. Because after 9/11, I started to discover, like everybody else, there was this whole truther movement and all sorts of, people like, wait a second, Building 7, and nothing makes sense. And I think it was an inside job and everything else. And over the years, I got to the point where, yeah, I thought it was an inside job, but not that inside job. We knew where the terrorist cells were. We knew who were paying them. We know that Dick Cheney knew where they were. We know that President Bush was briefed on them. And we knew that at the time, I mean, we're talking 25 years ago, 24 years ago, but we had a monumental security budget in intelligence. Could we have taken out those guys in a nanosecond? Oh, yeah. Who are those guys? Well, 14 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. What happened in the immediate aftermath of 9/11? I think there was 200 plus private planes that were able to fly out of restricted airspace in the United States when the entirety of the country was shut down, except for Saudi nationals and members of the bin Laden family that were able to get out of the United States. That's a fact. And there's more. And, I don't want to go too deeply into that other than to say, when you look through the lens of the Wayback Machine, why would we have allowed 9/11 to happen? Well, before all that took place, we understood, I shouldn't say understood, but there was a proclamation by the neocons at that time that had been calling for a spectacular attack. That was the only way to justify boots on the ground to go in to the belly of the beast and just rip the heart out of terrorism, which had been coming after us all over the world through bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and there was more, and there had been going back, I don't know, to the 50s, 60s, 70s, but it got worse and worse and worse with every decade. And by the time we got to 1998, it was really significant. Remember the embassy bombing in Nairobi, I think it was, and then of course the bombing of the Cole and so forth. And yeah, so did the United States give Al Qaeda enough rope to hang itself with? And oh yeah, I'm very familiar with Al Qaeda and Bin Laden in Afghanistan and the CIA and all of those elements. Yeah, this is a long story of intelligence and dark forces and money and guns smuggling and everything else that then is all preceded by none other than Kotchagate, that has a huge connection to all things Trump and Russia and everything else that I've got to get to now. I think I've been talking for way too long about the setup of this whole thing, but I did want to talk about my perspective on Gaza and Israel, because as someone who detests fascism, that's my red line. I'll give my life up against fascism. At the same time, I'm faced with this dilemma, right? Think about this, that Israel may have given Hamas enough rope to hang itself with, to have a full on genocide, as opposed to just making the case, look, we've got to have ongoing offensive operations in Gaza to root out whatever is in the tunnels and to do whatever we can. I don't know if they had to have collective punishment. And at this stage of the game, with the starvation and everything else that's been going on, I think that answer is pretty self-evident. But what did the Nazis do in the aftermath of the assassination of Love? I think I just messed up his name because obviously I'm talking about a lot of stuff. It led to Kristallnacht, and it led to the Holocaust. And I'm thinking to myself, am I watching the Jewish people? And I know probably 70%, even though I've heard numbers go different ways, but we saw hundreds of thousands of people before October 7th protesting in the street, every type of Israeli there is, against Netanyahu and corruption. But then absolute war happened, and they couldn't get rid of him, because that's what happens when you're a state like Israel surrounded by enemies, and it's life or death. And that's just pretty much the mentality from what I understand of the Israelis. And even though there's a lot of disagreement, and I'm sure it's intense disagreement, Israelis certainly know how to battle and verbalize their differences. But I can assure you that before I move on to the next stage, and I do want to say this publicly, and it is incredible, that Netanyahu has shown through his commitment and, quite frankly, brutality, not just against Gazans and innocents, but he took out the entire leadership of Iran. Like what, with the Revolutionary Guard, they went in and they took out everybody in Syria. They just went after Hamas. I mean, these guys are unbelievably effective at killing. Now, I wonder if maybe that's because 6 million of us were fucking thrown into gas chambers and pissed on and experimented on, and every inhumane thing you can possibly imagine after 1,000 years. Did that create the psychosis? I'm not justifying it. I can tell you that I'm not a passive person because of fascism. But at the same time, I'm like, wait a second. You can't use deception to initiate carnage because you're undercutting your own position. Because lies will always destroy the liar. They always will. And by the way, bringing it full circle to Charlie Kirk, yeah, was he asking questions about Israel? He was, even though he was, again, supported fiscally, financially, by pro-Israeli billionaires. So it's a sick, out of control world. But the point that you've got to understand in context of what I've been telling you about with corruption versus fuels fascism the whole time is that here we are with the Trump administration after Doge, after all things ICE, after destroying the federal government and NOAA and science, a war on education and everything that made us a superpower, everything that made us the United States, and most importantly, the law, has all been to manifest corruption, first and foremost. That is now giving us fascism. And the question that I'm asking is, do we have a Gaza-like initiative underway, plotted by everything from ICE to the military? And if so, the message that I would have to everybody in uniform is remember who you've pledged an oath to. You didn't pledge your oath to a crime boss who has been betraying the United States for 40 years. You pledged your oath to the Constitution. And yeah, we're at an inflection point right now because I come from the satirical age of the 70s, and I always like to talk about my love for Gonzo and my love for National Lampoon. And yeah, I've seen it all, a lot of it, right? But like the great David Byrne said, this ain't no party, this ain't no disco, this ain't no fooling around. And really, to go to the ultimate argument that is unfurling that has led to this sort of, justification, I suppose, of incoming or oncoming fascism is this notion of free speech, right? Free speech is protected unless you decry violence, which I'm not doing. I'm not saying we all have to spill into the streets and start a war. That's not what I'm saying by any means. What I'm saying is I am your last ditch effort to be able to inform tens of millions of Americans of exactly how the corruption works so that we can demand the final vestiges that are hanging on by their fingertips of the law to turn the tables on this RICO presidency. What is RICO? Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization, the mob. That's what's overrun our Supreme Court. It's overrun Congress. It's overrun the Department of Justice. And, of course, the White House through a buffoon, a guy that didn't pass or graduate without somebody cheating from Wharton Business School because he's been cheating his entire life. So what is it that I am revealing to you that nobody else will? Well, at the very beginning, I told you that I'm the producer with the $71 trillion truth. There's a billion and a trillion. The richest guy in the world right now is Larry Ellison, the company that just bought Paramount to give to his son who runs Skydance to basically work for, in cahoots with the Trump administration and kneecap the likes of 60 Minutes, which got kneecapped by corporate America a long time. So they were definitely plausible, capitulating to the system itself. But this system has been around for a very long time. The corruption has been there the whole time in the shadows. Trump is just bringing it out into the open and saying, what are you going to do about it? So what is the corruption that Donald Trump is in the midst of that is relevant to every single thing that we're talking about other than Charlie Kirk at the moment? All of it. And I'm going to start with the event that he flew jets over to drown out last week on the Capitol steps, which ironically had Mr. Ed, Marjorie Taylor Greene, basically giving a speech that made sense as what appears to be, I don't know, a plant, within the whole situation of the voices of the Epstein victims to call for revealing the Epstein files. And of course, Kentucky Senator Thomas Massie was in the midst, as well as Ro Khanna, doing bipartisan initiative to create the Transparency Act to release the Epstein files. And the Epstein victims were on the steps of Congress saying they've got to be heard. And part of that story was they were never heard by mainstream media. They were ignored by the power. And of course, half of MAGA, or maybe all of MAGA, wants to know, and that's why apparently many of them voted for Donald Trump, was to release the Epstein files, because they all think that it is just the elite Democrats and the Democratic funders, which might include guys like George Soros, but of course involves former President Bill Clinton and, yeah, Microsoft CEO and one of the richest people in the world, Bill Gates, among others. That's what they want to see. But oh, lo and behold, Donald Trump is on that list. Donald Trump, Jeffrey Epstein's best friend for 15 years. His neighbor down in West Palm Beach at Mar-a-Lago, where many of the girls came from, that Epstein turned into the Epstein girls that were used as honey traps, that were so sold into sexual slavery, that I guess both he and Trump were wagering that one of the women were depreciated. And of course, is it Virginia? Is it Guthrie? Giuffre committed suicide, and all of the other elements that go with it, which are, yeah, horrible stories that happened decades ago, but are relevant because of why? Because the system never sorted this out. And what did the system not sort out? The fact that rich people are above the law, that powerful people are above the law. Yeah, welcome to the story that I'm revealing to you. Yeah, if there are those that are above the law, and the law is the only thing that makes the United States, are we then the United States? Of course not. It's all an illusion. But the illusion is being shown in small pieces that can get you to the truth that I'm revealing to you. How? Well, in the case of Epstein had big time money involved with his apparatus. Big time money that involved billionaires. Now, incidentally, big time billionaires that had significant influence and relationships with Israel. That's not really what I'm going to talk about, but it is interesting. Les Wexner out of Columbus, Ohio, the purveyor of Limited and, of course, Victoria's Secret, where a lot of models would come in and out of, because they were recruiting models, including Melania, who became Melania Trump, who apparently had slept with Jeffrey Epstein a year in advance of being sold off, probably to Donald Trump, because of their sick, twisted, insane relationship that involved raping children. And yeah, Donald Trump is all over that list. And so it's so like cartoonish, and the buffoonery around this has always been something I've been like, are you kidding me? This is why I call Donald Trump the Mad Magazine Mad King, because it's like he was flying around on the Lolita Express during his campaign that he started, of course, in trying to think the place in Texas where the David Kardashians and all of that stuff was used to launch his campaign, because they're all anti-government, right? Not what's where Baylor University is. I can't think of the name of the town, but anyway, the Branch Davidians. But yeah, this stuff goes back our whole lifetimes. Those of us who are over the age of 50, quite frankly, right? And so Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, besties, and all of the elements that we've seen for years, the pictures, the parties, the this, that, and the other. And of course, then all of a sudden yesterday, Kash Patel is telling, Adam Schiff and Cory Booker, Epstein's where this whole thing begins and ends. And we all know that's ridiculous. And we all know that it's kind of ridiculous that the Democrats are going all after this to basically get Donald Trump in the crosshairs with MAGA. But we all know that there's no way that Clinton, we know, I think he was on Epstein's plane like 27 times. And there's more to come if all of this stuff was released. But of course, they're not going to release it. Why? Because we have two layers of law. We have the law coming down for the 99%, and the law is serving upward. Because of what? Corruption, which is the story behind the door, behind the door, behind the door, all on the way back of the guys that are puppeteering the system. And they have been forever, which is where I come in because of my work in the con and all of my work that leads to the Clean New Deal. And by the way, if you're feeling dirty with all this carnage of, fascism and the likes of genocide and hatred and those things that pedophilia and all of the other elements of this, I mean, makes you feel sick, doesn't it? Because it's so dirty. The world of lies is dirty, is it not? Do you want to get cleansed? Do you want the Clean New Deal? Yeah, you do. You just don't know what it is and why it exists. It exists because I've spent years and years and years getting inside the belly of the beast to understand the tumor and how this whole thing works, which of course is revealed in the blueprint, which is the con.tv, which reveals the largest criminal racketeering enterprise in history that never ended. That all of these elements are unfolding right in front of our face as all of this other chaos is happening. And war is a great diversion, I can tell you, right? You see these Venezuelans getting murdered that are supposedly drug runners, and I think Donald Trump said, on the lawn of the White House yesterday that the real terrorists are the ones, or the real murderers are the ones that are bringing in these drugs that killed 300 million Americans. The population of the United States is like what, 360 million? So like what, 85% of the United States population was killed by drugs? Yeah, that's where President Trump's mind is at the moment, which is not a good place, given everything that we're seeing, of course, with the moves that are happening with JD Vance, which is weird, Peter Thiel, which is weird, Elon Musk, which is weird, but it's all par for the course of the situation we're in. And it's like, I think the end, quite frankly, because of where we are with the state police potentially doing what we've seen in Gaza, and it would follow suit. And of course, Russia continuing its pathway through Ukraine and whatever comes next. All of this stuff has been on the books forever, I'm sure, militarily. It's just the players that are maneuvering these things for whom and why is the question. And it comes from really the gateway is Epstein because of what's going on. And, which is the information that I now have to finally try to close. So I'm tired. I'm really tired. I don't know if I want to keep going, actually. But I'm going to. I'm going to try. But I've gone for a while, and I don't know if I'm actually going to post this or not. I'll think about it. But here are the things that you have to understand that are all the vectors. Many of you out there are aware that Lisa Cook is a federal board governor that Donald Trump had accused with his henchmen from the FHFA, whose name eludes me at the moment, of mortgage fraud. Now, recent evidence has been revealed in a court that said that Lisa Cook can stay on as a Fed board governor. And the reason why this is such a huge question is the Federal Reserve has had independence, and that's the way it plays out in media, even though it is mandated, supposedly, presumably, constitutionally, through the statutes by Congress. It's supposed to have its independence, of which Donald Trump is in the process of hijacking, because Donald Trump wants complete control of the Federal Reserve so he can steal more money. He wants to lower interest rates. Now, if you understand what the Federal Reserve is, you understand that the Federal Reserve's mandates are to maintain low inflation and high employment. But what we've learned it's done over the course of the last 14 years is maintained asset values in the portfolios of the 1% or the 0.01%. And there's a monumental way that's happened. But I'm starting with Lisa Cook and mortgage fraud because Donald Trump, as we all know, lies, denies, switches the blame, and implicates. Every declaration is an admission of guilt. And what he's done recently, as we've all seen, is the first thing that comes out of his mouth, which is so telling, so ridiculous, considering the history of Donald Trump, But how many times have you heard him talk about falsification of records or forgeries? Did he not say that Lisa Cook was involved with falsifying mortgage documents because of the nature, and this is a technical situation of which it was proved that she didn't do, that he had accused her, and this is the only way you could get this is inside information from FHFA, which is also, I think, illegal, but he is the president, and there's something that the Supreme Court ruled about that. So here we are, but they said that Lisa Cook had used falsifications on loan documents to deceive that she had two primary residences when that's against the rules, which would then provide the president cause to fire her. And that's what they were looking for. They were looking for a loophole to try to fire a Fed board governor such that they could, get their people in to, in one way or another, potentially move out Jerome Powell, who, of course, is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who was being reluctant to lower interest rates, and who, of course, Donald Trump appointed to the Federal Reserve after Janet Yellen had stepped down during Trump's first term. And yeah, if that's enough to make your head spin, but really, that is the jewel in all of the control that the MAGAs and the technocrats and everybody wants, because they already got the Supreme Court, they got Congress a long time ago, they've gotten media completely, and now the Federal Reserve, right? And so to be determined and to be fought out in the Supreme Court, probably. But remember, mortgage fraud is the key vector here. Now, Donald Trump, as it turns out, has been involved with mortgage fraud and fraud his entire life. But let's just talk about mortgage fraud. So in 2024, en route to winning the presidency because Merrick Garland couldn't bring the entirety of the Justice Department to bring Trump down, because Merrick Garland may as well have been Neville Chamberlain. But the magnitude of Letitia James' case against Donald Trump for what is effectively mortgage fraud, because they proved he was lying to banks, and they got a civil judgment of $450 million because Donald Trump had increased the square footage of his penthouse, as well as tripling the per square footage of the value based on comparables, and a whole litany of other deceptive acts and practices, which are illegal, that Letitia James brought the case and successfully rendered a verdict against Trump for mortgage fraud against the bank, which is funny in every way, but primarily because Letitia James didn't actually do the full case. She didn't realize that Deutsche Bank was in on the fraud. And of course, Deutsche Bank was guilty of all sorts of violations and giant civil fines over the course of decades, because they were laundering money and all sorts of ill-gotten gains from the Russian Empire, from Vladimir Putin, into the United States. And there's a whole other incredibly complicated way that these guys, and ingenious to some degree, that they were doing so. But all of it, most of it, was going into Trump coffers, meaning his real estate empire. Which, when you understand the Trump story, you understand that Trump had been involved with dealing with drug, dealers and dark money interests from people involved with questionable activities, such as giant, gun dealers around the world, as well as people laundering money from all over the world into his Trump Tower, and before that into other Trump real estate. And this had been going on for a very long time. And Trump had experienced, by the way, from the late 80s forward, 6 bankruptcies. Now, there were many other times where Trump was on the edge of many other bankruptcies, but he was saved by the Russians. He'd been, a lot of people think, an asset of the Russians since the late 80s. And I believe that too, with more information than I'm willing to go into at the moment. But as it relates to mortgage fraud, what he accused through nefarious ways and probably criminal ways, the Fed board governor, that everybody's like, oh my God, and that's how he's going to take over the Federal Reserve to what, loot more billions of money and play for all of the people around the world to do what? Ultimately, probably collapse the dollar, to be honest with you, because of a situation with crypto. But I don't want to go into that aspect of it. Let's just stay on the point that I've connected Lisa Cook as a Fed board governor, Donald Trump, Deutsche Bank, and Putin. But there's more. So Jeffrey Epstein, and all of the revelations, not of the actual, salacious details of the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, but when you heard the press conference last week, where their attorney, a guy by the last name of Edwards, had proclamated, you're all asking the wrong questions, because they all wanted the women now, because they were girls then, to name names. But they can't, because they'll be sued into oblivion and destroyed if they do. And plus, they all got, part of the settlements that came from none other than J.P. Morgan Chase that took place in St. Thomas. I think it was 2022. But I'm sure many people knew of Chase's involvement with Epstein long before 2022. But a crack journalist that I happen to interact with, a gentleman by the name of David Enrich, who's written fantastic books, starting with the synergy between none other than Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump through none other than Deutsche Bank, in a book called Dark Towers. Yeah, I think that came out in 2018-ish, I believe. And then, interestingly enough, another incredible book that David Enrich wrote, and if I haven't already said it, he's the business editor of the New York Times, incredible journalist. But he wrote a book called Servants of the Damned, which is about all of the giant corporate law firms of this country and how they have been consistently destroying our democracy and the Constitution, because they get paid to basically allow corruption to flourish, of which they get huge fees for. And then he just recently released a fabulous book called Murder the Truth, which is about billionaires using libel to destroy the reason we have free speech to begin with, or one of the biggest cases of it as it relates to journalism in New York Times versus, oh my God, Sullivan. I was about to say something else. But if you understand who Peter Thiel is and Gawker and all this methodology of what billionaires can do to people in court, they can destroy you. And that's what that's what Murder of the Truth is all about. Because what did Donald Trump just do yesterday? He sued the New York Times for $15 billion for libel, even though the New York Times hasn't really revealed that much that I know, and they could know, and they do know, because they've shown their cards, because they've chosen not to, which is ironic about every aspect of our institutions that never went after the corruption that I'm telling you, and now it's coming back to bite everybody in the ass. So that's lesson number one. But last week on the front page of the New York Times, David Enrich and two other editors wrote a spectacular article that revealed Chase's involvement over decades with Epstein. And I can assure you there was a lot of major questions that came from that article that bleed into other things that I'm focusing on now, but primarily Deutsche Bank. Because, by the way, when finally Chase decided to say, Epstein, you're no longer our client, which came way after they all knew what he was doing, and they knew what he was doing from the beginning. But he just moved his business to Deutsche Bank. But that's funny, because other things were revealed recently, such as that the second job that Jeffrey Epstein had after he was at the Dalton School as a teacher in math, because he didn't have a degree and he was at the most prestigious school in Manhattan that just happened to be, the headmaster was former OSS, last name Barr, whose son became William Barr, who was the attorney general during Trump's first administration. But oh yeah, deep inside Conjugate back in the 80s, which is really the genesis of everything that we're in the midst of. And Jeffrey Epstein, after that, with no college education, gets a job working for none other than Ace Greenberg, legendary Wall Street trader, CEO of Bear Stearns, who two traders by the name of Chiaffi and Tannen were involved with massive, massive subterfuge in the subprime market that was coming from none other than liquid capital, Jeffrey Epstein's operation within Bear Stearns, which lines up with a lot of information that I have and part of what's behind the door to reveal the truth that they don't want you to know. That the Russians were laundering money through Western commodities, but particularly real estate, through all of these vectors of these financial apparatuses that would ultimately go through hedge funds and private equity firms into subprime. Subprime was the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in the history of the world. That blew up in 2008, 17 years ago. That fateful day when I thought I was going to make the biggest deal of my life, move on to have the most comfortable life in the world. Instead, I was thrown into this volatility after this tidal wave and this avalanche, and basically getting bounced off the reef, with my family on my back, or to mix metaphors, I was thrown out in the desert naked with no shelter, with no food, and I had to find a way to survival. And that survival was me pulling on the threads to figure out what the hell was going on in this world. That took me millions of dollars and thousands of hours and years to get to tell you this information that nobody else can or will. That is all imploding in front of our face. So we've got Lisa Cook, mortgage fraud, Donald Trump, Putin, Deutsche Bank, Epstein, subprime. If you watch The Con, you'll realize the whole thing was baked into a predatory lending scheme that the entire financial system was in on, that used the same methodology of honey traps, only insert houses instead of young girls for rich men. They used houses primarily for women and minorities initially, things that they really needed and wanted. Sound familiar? And they used it in a setup pattern to pump billions of dollars and eventually trillions through the system to set everybody up in the ultimate rat trap that would destroy tens of millions of Americans illegally. It was all racketeering. And if you watch The Con, you'll understand what that is. And I've got a whole lot more information than the first 5 episodes of The Con, but it also goes into all of the other stuff I've been doing for now years, because of how to get this information out there. That not only was the whole thing a giant racketeering grift using forgeries and deceptive acts and practices and mortgage fraud that would blow up the world, literally blow up the world. And tens of millions of people got crushed. Many of them wound up in the streets, of which, of course, the guy from Fox News says, hey, let's just involuntarily poison them? Or I can't remember what his exact words were, but euthanize them, I think he said. Yeah, murder all of the homeless. What did the Nazis want to do? They got rid of the gypsies. They wanted to kill the Jews. They wanted to kill all of the undesirables, right? Boy, this is coming from a lot of Jews in the system too, by the way, which is fucking amazing to me and absolutely disgusting. But I can assure you, there are a lot of very good Jews in this process too, and I'm one of them, that are dedicated to liberty and justice for all and Superman and everything else. And oh yeah, by the way, the people that created Superman and Batman and Gotham and all the rest, yeah, they were Jews, just so you know. So there's good and bad, no matter what race, no matter what religion. And, that's what this is all about. But moving on to hopefully the end of this, because I could go on for another 5 hours, but I got to bring this to a close. It's way longer than I wanted to. So thank you for tuning in if you happen to watch all of this. But the magnitude of the great financial crisis, which blew up in 2008, that's really where my story just began. Because the great financial crisis, which a lot of people think they understand, and they don't, but they think that a lot of people got into home loans that they couldn't afford to pay back, and they were the reasons, because they got greedy, that they blew up the global markets. They have no idea what the hell happened. In fact, there's a great film called The Big Short that does a really great effort at telling us what happened, but it barely scratched the surface. And I could talk to you about The Big Short for a very long time. In fact, it does play into what I have to finish up here. But in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, that were created because of forgeries, because of liars' loans, because the whole system was lying, to create a system that was weapons of mass destruction that blew up the global economy. We supposedly, when President Obama came in riding like a knight on a white horse, on a wave of hope and change we could believe in, to just basically double down on the system that created the problem in the first place, which is one of the greatest betrayals in the history of the world, considering Obama knew better, or he should have known better. He was smart enough to know better, but he was in the middle of it. So he was definitely doing triage, but there's a lot of questionable things. Many more questionable things, I can assure you, than what I've explored so far with Tyler Robinson. Okay. Let's just put it this way. I know that Barack Obama, as a junior senator in Springfield, Illinois, had written the legislation, anti predatory legislation, based on all of the elements that we show you in the con. So he understood liar's loans. He understood predation and he understood the market. But when he came up out of nowhere at that time, for those of you who might remember, when Hillary Clinton, with the Clinton name and their relationship with Wall Street, was suddenly put on the sidelines, when everybody, all the major Wall Street players, starting with Chase, JP Morgan Chase, led by none other than Jamie Dimon, who had just come into the CEO-ship of Chase at that time. He came out of, was it Bank of Illinois? I can't remember the bank. What am I saying? It was another large bank, but it wasn't it wasn't JP Morgan Chase, I can assure you. But it was like all the power vectors of Chicago were immediately behind Barack Obama. That includes the Crowns and the Pritzkers and all the billion-dollar apparatuses and everything else. So there's that, okay? And those are some of the questions that I'm alluding to, because in my work, for example, Barack Obama went on 60 Minutes to tell Steve Kroft that, oh, yeah, while Wall Street, what they did was horrible, it was simply unethical. That's legalese to obfuscate what Mark Dan, the former state AG of Ohio, says right after that in our film, in our work, The Con. I don't know how else to put this, but that's just bullshit. But here's the skinny, right? After tens of millions of people got fucking crushed by lies, by a world of lies, by deceptive acts and practices that the entire system is set up to prevent, the whole system was in on it because of revolving door and deregulation, decriminalization, and desupervision. And they were all getting paid. So they were all complicit in the most mammoth corruption in the history of the world that none of you knew existed. And in the aftermath, the way it was sold to the American people through Barack Obama bringing, as a new president, all of the polarized members of Congress that at that time were Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and all of the guys that are still there, minus Nancy Pelosi, basically had a kumbaya and said, we got to, come out of our polarization. We got to save the American people. So we're going to pass TARP, which was legislation to provide $700 billion in liquidity to the collapsing financial system so that we could create a floor that we could build out of, because the entire global economy depends on liquidity. And so basically our financial system was corrupt because of this giant corrupt enterprise. Bankrupt because of this giant corrupt enterprise. But that's not what we did, or all we did. That was the beginning. The powers that be at the time ended up circling the wagons and, through secrecy, created a scenario where they backdoored illegally $71 trillion over the last 14 years through 3 administrations to the apocalypse of greed, I guess, and criminality, to the financial system that completely controls the world, of which, of course, every piece of the story, from Lisa Cook as a Fed board governor to Donald Trump and mortgage fraud, because he was in mortgage fraud up to his eyeballs his entire career, and finally found guilty of it in 2024 because of Letitia James. But his involvement with Deutsche Bank and, of course, Putin, which everybody's like, why is he an asset for Putin? Yeah, this is definitely part of it. But then, of course, it's the lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. But this in the run up to today's, Federal Reserve reducing interest rates by whatever they did, which was a capitulation to Trump and more to come, especially if he wins through this whole process. But the whole case is going to go to the Supreme Court. And this in light, by the way, of Thomas Massey of Kentucky saying last week that once he had made the announcement of pressing forward to get this transparency bill of Epstein passed to release the Epstein files, that the billionaire powers that be, that include none other than Miriam Adelson and I think Paul Singer, but most importantly for this dialogue, John Paulson, were pulling out all the tricks to rug pull him because they don't want the Epstein files revealed. Now, why don't they want the Epstein files revealed? Are they in on it? Maybe. Are they part of a broader conspiracy that is a bigger deal than we know of, considering all of the things I mentioned about what Netanyahu chose to do after October 7th and the notion of genocide, and then what's happening with Stephen Miller in our country, with the police that are going to go after all these terrorist groups? Maybe. But what I can tell you is what I know about John Paulson and the Federal Reserve and the Supreme Court, that all of the powers that be don't want you to know. So, first and foremost, in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, like I said, we unleashed $71 trillion illegally to the largest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world. That, oh, yeah, by the way, made billionaires uber billionaires. This incredible power that these guys have. And it was none other than the Fed board governors that took all of this information that I've just revealed to you, that's in my work, The Con, particularly, and in the New Untouchables, which I have in the New Untouchables as well, because they came from whistleblowers and witnesses that knew all of this information, that literally pulled it through the system because they were the system and are the system. And they took it to none other than Fed board governor Ned Gramlich, who then took the information to none other than Fed board chairman Alan Greenspan, whose job it is to regulate markets. That's what they're all saying now. The Fed has to have independence because they have to regulate markets. Could you imagine this Wharton School dropout criminal thug regulating the global markets? Well, if you want them all to completely collapse and fail and create the biggest carnage in the history of the world, yeah, that might be a great move. But obviously, the adults are in the room. But guess what? They already did that. And they did it to basically save what's going on now. At least that's what they thought. They failed completely. Alan Greenspan failed completely because he had the information that I'm telling you and revealing to you in my work, that it was his job to regulate those markets to prevent everything that became the 2008 great financial crisis, that Congress was supposed to manage him, but they don't because of this idea of independence. And ultimately, what happened? He circles out 2 years before the crash because he knew it was coming. A guy named Ben Bernanke comes in, and everybody in media is like, oh, yeah, we learned our lesson during the Great Depression, so we're going to create this sort of flow infusion that they kept saying was TARP, but it was much more than TARP. It was what Hank Paulson, who was then Secretary of the Treasury, who came out of Goldman Sachs, not to be confused with John Paulson, and of course, Timothy Geithner, who said famously that the American people are going to be foam on the runway to protect the financial terrorism. So everything is perverted, inverted, inside out, just like all things Epstein, just like everything I've been talking about the whole time. And we gave tens of trillions of dollars to the guys that destroyed the world to save the world. How do you think that's going to go? Well, exactly the world that we're living in. And it was the Fed board governors that ironically tried to stop the Fed board chairman from doing what he was put there to do the whole time. Just like Kash Patel is there to cover for Donald Trump now. Just like Pam Bondi is there to be a weapon, or a private law firm, but a weapon for Donald Trump. Okay? That's what you do with political appointees, as opposed to the professionals that are actually in the institutions that do the job that we need them to do. But you can corrupt the whole system with one bad apple. But then, of course, you can also corrupt the whole barrel with the bad apple because of what we show you in the con, which is called control fraud. Yeah, I guess it's a lot, but not really, because in the end, it's not rocket science, it's racketeering. But so now you know that part of it. But here's the thing that we're all going to see as we move forward in the mortgage fraud, lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate circus to hide what everybody on the inside knows in this like Game of Thrones that's trying to get it all for themselves and destroy the rest of us, which is literally the full faith and credit of the United States. Which, oh yeah, by the way, for those of you listening to this going, oh yeah, it's all capitalism. It's all capitalism. No, this was socialism. We gave the full faith and credit of the United States to the mafiocracy. That's not capitalism. Now you could say, well, okay, we had, exploitative scenarios throughout our history, be they the robber barons, be they the Confederacy and the plantation owners, and that's capitalism, isn't it? Yeah, to a degree of it. But we also used the law, and we also had the Civil War, and we also had civil rights, and we also had World War II at great expense to get us to a point where we didn't do that, which we all came undone from Clinton forward, but it's really Reagan forward. But that's another story. But the Supreme Court may hear this case because it's going to question the independence of the Federal Reserve. And hopefully some journalist out there goes, oh, wait a second. We're talking about independence of the Federal Reserve, but it says here in the statutes that it is mandated by Congress. So wait a second. What has Congress been doing this whole time? Well, ask yourself this. If people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and, every other moron that we've seen in Congress that are, like barely have a high school education, at least by the way of their actions, do you think they know any of the stuff that I'm revealing to you? They're not paid to ask those questions, by the way. Although I will say Marjorie Taylor Greene actually sounded relatively astute the other day, so good on you, Marjorie, for whatever that means. But the Supreme Court 2 years ago heard a case from the Arkansas Teacher Pensions Union, teachers, as well as the Pipe Fitters of America, and as well as the Plumbers of America, working class people, that did a class action against none other than Goldman Sachs for blowing up their pensions as a result of the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, using liar's loans and all of these horrible products that I just demonstrated previously that you can see in our work at thecon.tv that blew up the world, that were designed to fail, as Warren Buffett once said. They were weapons of mass destruction. That, of course, his Moody's, which he owns, were the final stopgap that allowed it all to happen. And oh, yeah, by the way, Warren Buffett gave Goldman Sachs $5 billion in the aftermath, immediately in the aftermath to keep them afloat before they went completely bankrupt, before the government came in with the $71 trillion. But going back to the Supreme Court, they heard the case and they chose to say, because they didn't have the information, which is all of the information I'm providing you, they didn't do discovery. They didn't depend on the Department of Justice. They didn't depend on the FBI. They just said, oh, this was an act of God. When meanwhile, my work reveals, in addition to everything else that I've shown you, and this is stuff that was saved for season 2 of the con that I was never able to do because we got quashed, by the way, by BlackRock. But I have evidence in the information that John Paulson, who was a mid-level hedge funder at the time, and he was working with a guy by the name of Paolo Pellegrini, where they handpicked all the worst of the worst liar's loans, and there was a methodology to that, to pack in as weapons of mass destruction and securities that they sold all around the world to cities and countries and counties and to, pensions vis-a-vis the credit rating agencies. If you ever saw the Big Short, the woman who had, the sunglasses and she could see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil, as they, the guys who were doing the investigation thought that it was actually the strip dancers that caused the great financial crisis, which of course they didn't. It was these guys that I'm talking about. They handpicked the worst of the worst securities to sell in the world that took a $4.5 trillion housing bubble and turned it into a $900 trillion global calamity that destroyed the global economy, that then led to the Federal Reserve having to pull these emergency tricks that nobody ever knew about illegally to guarantee and float the largest racketeering effort in the history of the world, on top of the fact that guys like John Paulson, who were doing this stuff illegally, shorted the market and created the biggest trade in the history of the world. The largest trade prior to this event was George Soros, who shorted the English pound. And I think, or it wasn't the pound. It was actually maybe it was, but it was some currency, but I think it might've been associated with gold. Don't know why I'm not thinking that, but I think I've been talking for about 2 hours. They, the sterling, the English sterling, that's what it was. And he made $1 billion from that trade, which was legendary, huge. It was like, oh my God, this guy's, magnificent for Wall Street, that sort of thing. This guy who was literally a nobody supposedly goes in and gets all of this information, does his homework, and then shorts the markets, backs up the Brinks trucks. And in comparison to George Soros's $1 billion on the largest trade in the history of the world, these guys got away with $20 billion. And then they were the recipients of all the shit that happened afterward. In fact, as it turns out, John Paulson went and bought Greece. And that's a whole nother part of the story, the information that I have. But John Paulson, as it turns out, the guy who, set everybody up to fail and then made 20 billion from it. Yeah, he was also involved, as it turns out, after raping and pillaging the pipe fitters of America, the plumbers of America, the teachers of America, and the Supreme Court saw no evil, heard no evil, spoke no evil because they didn't do the investigation that I did that shows you what's happening behind the scenes, behind the door, all the way in the way back, that shows how all of these guys did it and they're getting away with it, that are unfolding all before your eyes. Yeah, these guys, because of that, bailed out all of the bad players, including Russia, with the money that is built on your blood and soil, and your blood, soil, and toil, quite frankly, the American people, that they evaporated into, or they just digitized into thin air to give themselves, that just led to this enormous stockpile of cash crack, as many people refer to it, over the course of the last 14 years, where these guys just continue doing the same thing over and over and over, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And I could walk you through a whole nother garden variety of frauds that lead up to, of course, all things crypto now. But the guy that's been in the midst of it the whole time is, of course, none other than Donald Trump. With now, as you can see, the composite of the complicity of the Federal Reserve and the Supreme Court and John Paulson, and they all intersect with Epstein. Why does John Paulson not want people to know about the Epstein files? Well, maybe it's to protect the guilty, of which he's one. And I'm not suggesting that he himself is on the Epstein files, even though he is. But let's just say I don't have any reason to speculate that he was involved with sleeping with underage girls, which I wouldn't be surprised if he was. But maybe he doesn't want people to know about the money, about the Supreme Court, about the methodology that extracted so much incredible wealth out of the United States into the pockets of the few to further create the calamity that is now leading to what? Uber fascism. And oh yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people in my tribe are doing it. I'd like to say shame on you, but there are no epitaphs in my mind that doesn't go through what I want to say right now to you. I'm so sickened and ashamed by everybody who is part of this madness, the carnage, this ocean of lies and deception. What have we known since the 14th century? And imperialism. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so my final closing argument to you at the moment, given everything that's going on, and I can't believe I've talked this long. I really hope you guys took notes. I really hope you hear what I'm saying. I really hope you discover the con at thecon.tv, and more importantly, the Clean New Deal, which when you have knowledge of the problems, only then can you figure out how to fix the problems. And the only way we can fix the problems is with the integrity of law and smart people that know how to run the USS aircraft carrier, as opposed to leading us on the USS Titanic into the ultimate, iceberg that we can only see that much of the top of, right? Which you'll see that my colleague, Roseanne Rabiella-Mille, and our friend and colleague, Tosh Labram, had designed on our YouTube page, which I think is extraordinary, is they have this little image that says stop lying. What I say is, when you live in truth, you live in light. When you live a lie, you are depraved. When you have the truth, you're bulletproof. When you live a lie, inside you die. Stop lying. Stop buying lies. When you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in liberty and decency, sustainability, beauty, integrity, when we merge in unity behind the Clean New Deal, that's our destiny. To purge the misery of tyranny, to unleash the renaissance of possibility. Go right now to the precepts of the Clean New Deal. Listen to what I said 100 times. Watch everything that I put together. Watch everything that Roseanne Rabiola Mile talks about throughout social media, but particularly Blue Sky with our memes. We've got the answers that the entire system of this global rotting corruption, where only pimps, whores, junkies, and parasites thrive, can be destroyed. And you have to understand that this is the construct of how it works. And is this the moment? Is this the moment that all the evangelicals and all of the people on that side of the fence, have always, and I think that really is what this whole scenario between right-wing Christo-fascists in America and, of course, Zionist or the far right in Israel, it is all predicated on this fusion of Armageddon and the rapture. I think that's what this is all about. Or at least that's what they're thinking about in their hive network to continue moving it all, as fast as they can to get to that point. And the carnage is going to be biblical. It will be if we don't step in with the Clean New Deal first, because you have to become a nuclear reaction vector to the Big Bang of truth. Why? Because as we know, this ocean of madness, these liars, this depravity, it's the black hole. It's darkness. But what does it say when you open up the Bible? Let there be light. And in the universal construct, the reality is, like I said, when you live in truth, you live in light. And the Big Bang, the singularity, forced light into darkness to create this unbelievably expansive, mind-bending, trippy, confusing, beautiful, surprising symphony of everything that we're in the midst of. But we've got the answers that can turn the tables on corruption. All you have to do is live true. Please like, subscribe, and share. Please join us. Onwards and upwards.